Welcome to the Humans and Earth podcast. We bring you inspiration and practical resources for healing our planet and ourselves. It's time for soulful contributions that regenerate life on Earth. I'm Shara Arman, a thought leader and teacher who believes we're ready to renew Earth and heal ourselves in the process. You can find our work online at humansandearth.com and on Instagram at schoolhumansearth. I'd love for you to be on our newsletter list and receive our updates on Instagram. Please share our work at the School for Humans and Earth with anyone you think might be interested, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast so that we can include more and more people in the regeneration revolution that I believe is happening on planet Earth. Welcome to today's episode. Welcome back to Humans and Earth. I am really excited to bring you today a conversation with Paul Moss. Paul is the co-founder and executive director of the Plant Initiative, which you can find at plantinitiative.org, and I'll put that address in the show notes. It is a nonprofit organization that he started in November of 2020 that works collaboratively with others to advance respectful treatment of plants. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Society, where he's focusing his work on the relationship between people and plants. He has an undergraduate degree in biology and master's degrees in agronomy and marketing. Paul, I think I told you when I reached out to you, I think the Plant Initiative newsletter is amazing. It's like, well, I don't really eat candy, but if I ate candy, it would be like a candy box for me. I am so excited by the care that you and or maybe your collaborators are taking to put together this in-depth treasure trove list of all kinds of webinars, conferences, books, learning and advocacy opportunities related to plants. So thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate what you're putting forward.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction and for letting people know about the Plant Initiative and our work in our email newsletter. We just send it out once a month. And it's also posted on our website, past issues. So if people are interested, we more than welcome you to sign up and to learn about it. Really, our organization is trying to help create a movement to increase respect for plants. So we really do want to reach out to people of all over the world and of all kinds of interests to try and find some common cause in this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I really encourage people to sign up for the newsletter. And hopefully it's for you, but if it's not, sign up so that you can forward it to somebody else, because this work is really important right now. And I know there is a lot of interest. So I wanted to start by asking you how you came to this work in plant advocacy. And then we'll go on to how you describe what you're trying to contribute right now. But let's just begin with what path brought you here?
Well, thanks. That's, I really have always felt a connection with plants, even when I was, a little kid. I feel that for whatever reason, I just really enjoy being around them and looking at them. And as I learned more about plants, both as a child and later on in school, I learned just how complex they are, and also about some of the really unusual aspects of plants that I think a lot of people maybe don't really know or understand, just about how they're able to communicate with each other, how they can sense things in the environment, sense threats and respond to them, and really began to realize that plants are, especially in more recent years, how are intelligent and sentient beings. And then that really brings up a lot of different ethical issues then. Not that all beings shouldn't be treated with respect regardless of their characteristics, but in particular when there's organisms that are sensitive and probably feel pain and have other kind of conscious states, that I think we can't just treat them as just objects and resources. And so I feel that I haven't really seen a lot of organizational focus on that topic. Certainly within the animal advocacy movement, there's been for many decades, starting in the 1800s, a lot of work to advocate for the interests of animals and for more humane treatment of animals and eventually for liberation of animals. But for plants, really, there have been some scattered voices that have called for consideration of plants in that regard. But for the most part, I haven't really seen any organizations that have developed with that goal. So I feel that, so we held a conference back in 2021 called Toward a New Way of Being with Plants. And the talks from that conference, which had 30 speakers and attracted over 1,500 registrations from throughout the world, are still online, and you can find them through our website or just through our YouTube channel. For the Plant Initiative YouTube channel, there's a link into that. But in any case, that really was a catalyst towards seeing if there's enough interest in this topic and people thinking of plants in a different way, and a more respectful way. And if there's enough that we could potentially crystallize some kind of a movement in that direction. And the Plant Initiative really grew out of that event as an organizational home for efforts that can help to increase respect for plants. So, I've had training in agronomy, which is a very it's a field where plants are usually just treated as resources. It's basically field crop production. And so I'm actually particularly interested right now in issues related to that, because if you think of the use of plants by people, certainly within agriculture, is a huge aspect of that. There's literally trillions of plants that are being grown every year for agricultural purposes. And I don't know that there's a lot of consideration right now for what are the quality of their lives? What do we owe them as sentient and intelligent beings in terms of the way we treat them? So that's an area that I find particularly of importance and interest.
Yes. Okay. Everything you said lights me up. I should acknowledge, I don't know if I told you this, I've been a total plant person since I was a toddler. They're just completely inspiring and intriguing to me through this whole lifetime. And I think it's interesting that you have this background in agronomy, sort of similar to Dr. Jim Conroy, whose work I'm sure you know. I've studied with Jim and Bazia. I agree with you. The agriculture aspect is so important. And I can't remember whether I told you, I teach a sustainable agriculture class that I'm really passionate about. So we can talk about that. That would be wonderful. I guess the only other thing I want to mark, maybe mostly for our listeners, is we are in such an extraordinary time right now, in that there's a flowering of science-based scholarship that is supporting everything you just said. So I've never plotted out all the ways that people might care about plants. I mean, I certainly think about herbalism and indigenous animist perspectives, which are really important and I think are being revived maybe. Certainly plants as nutrition, then agriculture. maybe all of this is coming together with the plant initiative as one of the hubs, but it's pretty amazing right now that we have a number of scientists who are putting forward work showing exactly what you were talking about a few minutes ago, that plants appear to be sentient, that they can make decisions, that they don't just adapt over centuries or millennia, but they can adapt to their circumstances in a matter of minutes, hours, or days. So to me, it's extraordinarily exciting to see all these different ways of looking at and being with plants coming together. And feel free to take that anywhere you want to.
Agree. I agree. I think looking at things from the biological perspective is very helpful because, plants and animals, we all have common ancestors. And, so it's not like plants just arose like in a completely different track than we did as animals. There's a lot of common genetics between plants and animals. And even though our bodies are not organized in the same way, animal bodies and plant bodies, the functionality that plant organisms and animal organisms have are really very similar. So I don't think it's really much of a stretch to consider plants as intelligent and sentient, just like we would consider any kind of an animal. And I think we just don't necessarily understand them as well as animals, because I think we've had a lot of conflicts of interest. Certainly in Western culture, there's been a lot of incentive to use plants as resources and to, not consider them, and to consider them in a more hierarchical way. I know that you've talked about this in a recent conference, and certainly Matthew Hall in his wonderful book, Plants as Persons, really outlines this, but just the way that plants are treated as inferior beings historically, all the way back to ancient Greece and Western culture, as lesser beings is still really with us. And I think that especially because we in the Western world have a lot of incentive to use plants and not really think about moral issues in terms of their lives. I think that it's been really problematic. But the scientific studies that you're talking about are increasingly flourishing. There were some earlier scientific studies as early as in the early 1900s and probably before, but Jagadish Chandra Bose, did some really wonderful research on plant sentience, especially with sensitive plants, Mimosa pudica, back then. So it's not like, but again, it didn't really take hold, I think, for some of these reasons that I'm talking about, just kind of a general prejudice against plants, and then and not really wanting to go there in terms of this topic. Another problem I think happened, and it was a mixed issue. I think that the book that came out, The Secret Life of Plants, in the 70s, it included a lot of information about some of these alternative ways of looking at plants and plant sentience and consciousness. And it also included some things that a lot of people felt like in the academic community were inappropriate and like pseudoscience. And so in a way, it kind of scared away some of the extreme research on plant sentience and intelligence for a few decades. But recently, in recent years, we're seeing definitely people that are interested in this topic. A nice summary book is Planta Sapiens, which just came out this year, from Paco Calvo and Natalie Lawrence. And there's a video interview with them on our website if you'd like to see that, as well as you can probably find other interviews with them as well online. So I think that there are definite ways in which we're seeing that plants are responding to same kind of stimuli in an active, intelligent way. And really, that's all that intelligence really means, is just that you take in information, you process information as an organism, and then you make an appropriate response. So plants aren't just like automatically doing everything by reflex. They have to, they're perceiving light, they're perceiving water situations, pest damage, nutrient availability, there's sound that they can perceive. So they have to integrate all of these different stimuli. They can't just respond in automatic ways to one. They have to kind of combine all this information, and then they have to come up with a response that will allow them to live and hopefully to reproduce. So that's what intelligence is. And really all organisms are intelligent, because even a unicellular organism like a bacteria or a single cell organism of any kind, they're able to make those kinds of decisions as well. And part of making those decisions is to have a feeling of what we would call pain. In other words, you have certain stimuli that cause damage to you or unpleasantness, and then you can respond. And so whereas plants don't move, they're not actually moving. They can't, just uproot themselves and go to a new location if they're in an inhospitable environment. They can do certain things that are very effective. They can increase the composition of their bodies, the toxic aspects of it that will deter pests and predators. They can grow in different ways. They can share information with others and perceive information from other plants so that they can prepare themselves in advance for various kinds of threats. So they're actively doing a lot. And even though, we don't have the ability to see what they're doing in most cases, because they move a lot slower or in silent ways or underground where a lot of their activity occurs, we can be assured that they're sensing. And I think a really good book was written by Daniel Chamovitz, and it was called, what was it called? I'll think of it in a second. But anyway, it's basically showing how plants can sense just like we can in different ways, So I would just recommend. I'll think of that name and bring it to you in a minute. But anyway, there's a lot of resources that are out there. Monica Gagliano has written books. Anthony Travavas. So there's plenty of scientists that are now dealing with this issue.
One thing I think is really interesting that you're doing a wonderful job of bringing forward is the way in which our cultural assumptions are actually quite behind our science. So, I don't know whether you like to talk about, spiritual or direct intuitive connection to plants. That's interesting to me. If it is or isn't to you, no problem. But, just to stick with the science for a moment, since that's easier for a lot of people, it really seems like we need to keep doing a lot more of exactly what you're doing, which is pointing out that the major assumptions in many cultures in the world, particularly industrialized cultures, that plants are inert. Of course, they don't have anything like intelligence. They're relatively unimportant. We might advocate for human well-being and animal well-being and the environment as a whole, but plants, they're on the edges. Those assumptions are not a match with the science of, say, the last 50 to 100 years, which has shown exactly as you just laid out how complex and sophisticated plants are. And so there's this weird irony, and I hear this from people, where they think they have a scientific understanding of plants as basic and kind of unimportant, but that's actually a totally unscientific understanding of plants. So that piece seems like it needs to be, shouted from the rooftops. I was also thinking, as you were talking, about the missing piece of gratitude. I drink tea all the time, and I eat a lot of plants. And as I say to my students, even if you're pure carnivore, your survival is totally dependent on plants, because the animals you're eating are eating plants. We would not be here. And then, of course, there's the oxygen issue, which I love to talk about with my students and say, when was the last time that you photosynthesized and produced oxygen? But you might say we're close to 100% dependent on plants for our survival. And that awareness and the gratitude that should ensue from that has really been missing from Western and industrialized cultures for a long time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, it gets into the whole issue of operationalizing like an ethical or more respectful way of treating plants. I mean, how does that occur? And a lot of that's been, I think, a stumbling block for
Yeah.
having any kind of a plant advocacy movement is because, as you're saying, we're all ultimately dependent on plants and specifically on taking plant lives directly or indirectly for our survival. And so it's not a simple situation. It's not as clear-cut a situation as with animal advocacy, like when you're thinking about, mammals or dogs, cats, farm animals. You can argue that we really do not need to kill them, do not need to be harming them. They can be really, treated separately. Whereas with plants, we do. So it makes it more complicated. But I think what you brought up is really important about the issue about respect, reciprocity. And I agree that we have a lot that we can learn from indigenous perspectives on that. And I think from the plants themselves. I mean, you brought up the whole issue of kind of intuitive communication with plants. So I think these are both really important issues because I think a lot of the challenges to plant advocacy come about when people say, well, we don't really know what the plants want. We don't really know. So in other words, people get I ask the question, well, how would we know how a plant wants to be treated? And then for many people, that just shuts down the whole topic. It's like, well, there's the feeling, well, we can't know, and therefore we're not thinking about it. Instead of saying we can't know, but yet there are some way, maybe we can know. One way would be just to argue we can know, perhaps through just intuitive communication with plants directly. We can know because of the kind of wisdom of indigenous cultures, and we can know just from using certain principles, which I know you've talked about as well, but I think it's important to repeat that, which is like Mark Bekoff in his books. He's a noted animal advocate, but also extends his caring and concern to other beings beyond animals as well. But he talks about two different principles, which I think are really important. And I know that you've mentioned them as well. One is the golden rule, and that is just a universal principle in pretty much all known human ways of thinking about spirituality, about ethics, is just the idea that we should be treating others as we would want them to be treated, or conversely, we shouldn't do things to others that we wouldn't want them to do to us. So we can apply that simple principle to a life of a plant. You can think of a plant in your garden, in a crop field, in a forest, and you can think, well, if I was that plant, even recognizing that you're not a plant and you have different needs, how would I want to be treated? Would I want to be cut down and pulverized for wood chips? Would I want to, have my children, my seedlings, be treated disrespectfully? Would I want to have genetic modification on my genome? Certain things you could think, well, maybe I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want some other being to do that to me. So that's one way of looking at plants in terms of trying to figure out how can we be more ethically related. And a lot of that has to do with respecting them and considering them as fellow beings. And the other issue that Mark Bekoff and others, I think you've brought it up as well, is the precautionary principle is that, well, just because we don't have an answer to a question, it doesn't mean that we can't act as if, we can't in a precautionary way act to prevent harm. So we can, even though if we can't, let's say there's debates on whether or not plants can feel pain or not. So even if we can't maybe know that officially or prove that, we should act as if that's the case, because there's certainly a good probability of it. If, and I would be convinced personally that they can feel something like pain. So I think that it just shows that there are these kind of ethical ways of relating that we can apply to plants when if we want to.
I think that's really helpful. And I was thinking as you were talking that I guess one of the exciting things about the complexity of the awareness that we're coming into as human beings is that we're also recognizing that when we harm plants, we harm ourselves. So, we know now that Roundup, glyphosate, the very popular herbicide of the last few decades, is a probable human carcinogen. And I haven't followed that issue closely, but from what I understand, there have been successful lawsuits against its manufacturer by people who appear to have developed serious cancers from glyphosate exposure. And, similarly, there are concerns about when we genetically modify the plant genome, that we may then be creating plants that might be damaging to our bodies or not as nutritious. When we apply excess nitrogen fertilizer, for example, which is problematic, I assume, for the plant itself eventually, but certainly for the soil and the surrounding environment, we're creating dead zones in bodies of water that are important to humans and the whole planet. So it's really interesting how, as you said, I think the golden rule is helpful. And then it takes us to that deeper level of something like unity consciousness or a really deep biosphere awareness that whatever we do to plants pretty much ends up coming back to us. And that gives us a lot to consider.
I think that's a good point. And I think that it brings up another ethical approach to use when talking about treating plants respectfully. There's the whole enlightened self-interest here. It's what you're talking about, and these are not arguments I always use, but I think they're definitely valid, and they definitely, people can relate to them. Is that, yes, if we treat plants poorly, we're actually damaging our ecosystem. We're damaging our Earth's life support system. We're damaging our health. We're damaging the soil, the waters. So there's social aspects too, in terms of social justice issues, in terms of the way crops are grown. So we are all in one system, and we are, when we treat others of all types that poorly, it is going to come back to us in one way or another. So I think that it's important to realize that even if you don't want to think about plants as beings that need to be respected for themselves, for their own intrinsic value, and in respect with their own feelings and sensitivity, it still makes sense to treat plants respectfully and to think about their lives in a way in which we value them, because it's going to affect our lives, the nutrient content of our food, the type of soil runoff that's contaminating our rivers, even the type of economic survival of smaller farmers if they're buying a lot of expensive chemical additions for their crops. So there's a lot of ways in where you can make a good argument for ethical treatment of plants or ethical consideration of plants, not even based on some of these other ethical arguments. And I think the issue of also this unitary consciousness is also really important. And I think that we need to, in terms of dealing with plants, we need to be willing to be open about spiritual topics, because I think that otherwise it's just all in too confined, narrow human terms, the arguments. And so I feel that, for me personally, I have had experiences, intuitively communicating with plants. I really believe that plants are able to communicate with others, and there are many people in the dominant culture that feel that way, and it's certainly has been integrated into many indigenous perspectives for many years, that plants are our relatives, that plants are able to communicate with us. They are, beings like we are. They're not like off in some different, unique, split off category. They're relatives. They're relatives that we have, and that they have a lot of the same capabilities that we have. And so, it gets into issues always of, anthropomorphism. People would say, well, you're just anthropomorphizing the plants, or you're just projecting onto plants. I mean, one of the issues and problems with anthropomorphism as a critique of the way that plants are treated is that it basically assumes that all of these characteristics of consciousness or wisdom or language or whatever it is are just human characteristics, and it puts the burden of proof on every other organism to show how they're like humans, and because otherwise you're just projecting on them. I would say we should have a converse way of looking at other beings and just assume, that because they've been around on Earth for 3 billion years like we have, them and their ancestors, that they have all of the same qualities that we have in terms of sentience, conscious intelligence, ability to feel pain, and let people prove that they don't. So I think you can turn that around, and you can, instead of saying, that it's anthropomorphic to ascribe various characteristics to other beings, you can just say, well, they prove that they don't have those characteristics, because the evidence is that they do.
Yeah, that's wonderful. One thing I want to mark is how much change and shift I see occurring over about the last 10 to 20 years, because you and I both belong to the academic, higher ed, card carrying, multiple degrees community, and we're having this conversation. And you've listed various works of scholarship by other people who are also in the academic and scholarly community. I see that as a real change and tremendously exciting. These topics have gone from fringe and weird to right in coming into a more central place in various kinds of conversations. And I think that's really, really neat. I'm wondering if the next place we could go is, how do you help people with the practical ethics of this? Because one of the first things that I hear people say, and I bet you've heard this one too, when I start introducing aspects of this conversation, people say, well, should I stop mowing my lawn? I can't stop mowing my lawn. It'll turn into, wildness. Should I stop eating? It's very interesting to me that people, they do go to big important questions right away, but then they feel completely stuck, and so they drop the conversation. How do you help people with that?
Good question. Thank you. One thing I just want to mention, I was able to find the name of the book by Daniel Chamovitz on what it's called, What a Plant Knows. And he's a regular plant scientist, and it really is a good book that explains how plants sense. So anyway, but back to your question. So I think that is one of the challenges, is that, there are, no, it's not quite as simple as like being like a vegan or a vegetarian. Hang on one second. So it really is a way that there are a number of things we put on our website in a page called ACT. And basically there are several categories. You can do things that respect plant lives. Like there's ways of eating even that where you don't necessarily have to kill the whole plant. You can eat, seeds or fruit or leaves. Now it's not like I don't eat full plants. I do eat carrots and onions and other things like that. But I think there are things you can do on that respect. You can also try and prevent waste of plants lives. So a lot of plants are used in a very wasteful manner. There's a lot of food waste and a lot of other types of agricultural waste where these plants were grown, and because they weren't treated very well post-harvest, or they're, so you can try and avoid wasting food. That's certainly, those are some simple steps that you can take. There's also issues about, protecting plant communities. There's a lot of types of endangered plants, which need help. There's ways of, protecting trees or plants in your own yard, treating them respectfully, treating your house plants respectfully. But I think that the question of what do you eat is not as clear cut as it can be with veganism. And still, even I think some of the arguments that veganism has are helpful, though, even for reducing the amount of use of plants, because you are going to be eating a lot fewer plants if you're eating plants directly, even though it's not intuitive. If you have a big bowl of plant food, you're going to be eating less plants than if you have a big bowl of animal derived food, milk or meat or eggs or cheese or whatever. So that's, certainly you can adapt those types of practices, through vegetarianism or veganism, and reduce your way that you're going to be, harming plant life as well. There's also types of agricultural practices that you can support, such as sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, organic agriculture. I mean, there's all different degrees within these categories, but these often are ways in which plants are grown that are more respectful of plant lives, and that they're giving plants, better soil conditions. They're reducing the chemical inputs, and whether it's through fertilization or pesticides, so there's various things that you can do. And again, I would just refer people to the list of things on our webpage if they're interested in just thinking about this, because, in a way it is based on your attitudes about plants and having a more respectful way of dealing with plants. But in other ways, it's important that there are certain, actual practices that you do that translate that, because sometimes there's a big gap between a person's like ideological or philosophical leanings and then what they actually do. So we're trying to bridge the gap. I think they're both important. It's important to change people's attitudes about plants so that they do approach them as beings that are more or need to be treated more respectfully, but also to give some idea of some practical steps that people can take. And I think that, there's certain traditions. I'm not an expert in any way, but in Plants as Persons by Matthew Hawley talks about the Jain religion quite a bit, and how they see plants as having souls, and then they avoid eating certain types of plant products, such as when it kills the entire plant. So there are other traditions besides Western traditions in which plants are treated, respectfully, but certainly trying to, reduce the waste of plants. In terms of mowing the lawn, I think that's a realistic concern. Maybe there's ways of reducing the amount of lawn that you have so that you can allow more plants to grow through their natural lives. There's ways of thinking about what does a plant need to do to flourish, and how can we help a plant to have a flourishing life, to live a full life. And mowing them down in a lawn isn't really allowing them to go through their full life cycle. It cuts down before they go to seed. So, if there's a way to eliminate a lawn, that would be a better approach. But I think we are, as humans, we are destined to inflict pain on plants. There isn't really an alternative to that. And I think a better way to look at it is like the way that indigenous people look at the way they relate to the natural world, and in terms of, treating, these other beings as relatives that need to be treated respectfully. So they're recognizing that we need to use them for our purposes. There are definitely ways that we can kind of show respect by not over harvesting, by not, by replanting if we're taking them, by by really thinking about things as how it would affect those individual plant lives.
Yeah, I think that's all really, really helpful, calling us into a more complex understanding of what kind of impact we're having as we try to support our own lives. I appreciate that you referenced the various options in so-called sustainable agriculture, because I agree with you. Anyone who can, support their local organic or sustainable farm, shop at the farmers market, be part of a CSA or other farm supportive buying approach, try to buy the organic or the biodynamically grown or the regeneratively or even locally grown plant foods when they're purchasing foods. Those are acts of respect and collaboration with plants. Not that they make things perfect, but there's a real difference, as I think a lot of people now understand. There's a real difference between mass producing plants on an industrial scale, where the farmer really can't possibly know all of his or her fields. Wendell Berry, of course, has talked about this for a while, because the scale is so massive and everything is handled with large machinery. There's a big difference between that and a smaller scale operation where the farmers are really interacting with and knowing their plants and caring about them in some way. So I think that's, a positive place where we can all engage. And not surprisingly, there are significant benefits to our health and our local economies when we support that kind of agriculture and food production. I also loved that you talked about food waste, because what I notice is that people understand that very well and really see it as a terrible problem. And it's also very connected to social justice issues. So that's an easy place for us to look. Yes, we want all humans to have access to food. There are all kinds of moral and ethical reasons for that, as well as economic reasons. And simultaneously, as we care about that, we are giving consideration so that plant lives are not being wasted. So yeah, thank you for that helpful array of ideas. And I hope people will take a look at the website and see the full list that you all produce.
I think that one of the issues is for us as the Plant Initiative, we would like to see the consideration of plant lives just be introduced into the conversation. So all the other reasons for doing things are really good. And I think that they can only be in a way supported if people think about the question about what about these plant lives and what does it mean for those individual beings as well to be involved in agriculture or horticulture or whatever. So it's right now the conversation doesn't really include that. And I think at least as a first step, it would be good if, when you're thinking about issues of, let's produce huge acres of ethanol or other, use plants for biomass burning or whatever, and sometimes they're even couched in terms of positive things like energy independence or, reducing greenhouse gas emissions or whatever. But there isn't the really consideration that there's a lot of living beings, huge numbers of living beings involved in those decisions. And so I think at the minimum, that needs to be in the equation. And I think that when people start thinking about these issues and including that in the conversation and in their moral calculations, that I think that a lot of unique and positive solutions and options can be developed. Right now, I think the questions aren't being asked. So we especially would like to see people start to ask those questions, start to just put it on the table that, hey, when we're talking about sustainable agriculture, we're talking about regenerative agriculture, let's just, it's not just about the environment and equity and economics. It's also, there's like this whole other issue about our ethical treatment of these other non-human beings that are involved in the process. And with animals, I think that has definitely entered the conversation for a long time in agriculture and otherwise. And what we're saying is that it should be extended to plants. I think another challenge is that including plants in the conversation, which I haven't really mentioned before, is just that it gets into the issue about microorganisms and fungi, and I think people can get easily overwhelmed when you think about, okay, if all living beings need to be treated with respect, and if microorganisms are also living beings and they have all these same characteristics of sentience or intelligence or whatever, or probably consciousness, then what is our responsibility to them? In a way, it's the same answer. It's like we're going to be, unfortunately, by our lives, we're going to affect microbial communities, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't consider them as having no value. Obviously, they have huge value within our own bodies because our whole microbiome is so critical, and that is one of the things that's recently been discussed a lot in health, is that how dependent we are in our microbiome and in a healthy microbiome. So we're interconnected with these other beings, and I think that it's not that hard for people to think about treating their own microbiome in their body with respect. But I think that could also be extended to farm fields, and not just because it's good for plant health or soil health or any other benefit, but just because these beings, trillions and trillions of beings, have their own lives and need to be considered. So I think it does get into some other areas, and I don't feel that like the plant initiative wants to be like really chauvinistic about plants. It's not like there's like a line, and well, if it's not a plant or if it's like a fungus, then we don't care. I think the point is that all living beings should be treated with respect. And there are philosophical traditions, certainly indigenous traditions and Western traditions, where all beings are considered of ethical importance.
Yeah. I like that you referred to our growing awareness about the microbiome. And I was also thinking about growing awareness over, say, the last 20 years about the importance of pollinating insects. Because from my perspective, I do see more and more humans expanding their sense of who is important. And that can only support your work, I would think, because you're right. I mean, these are very comparable or partner examples. Just as I need my microbiome in order to survive, I need the trees to survive. I need the pollinating insects, and we're all part of this enormous collaborative, interdependent system. So I think we can be encouraged that we are warming up to this greater complexity in a lot of different ways. And I think they're synergizing with one another.
I think this point, which you're kind of alluding to, and, about dualism and the very negative approaches of looking at the world in a, breaking it into categories that are opposed to each other, like human, non-human, human nature, culture, nature, all these types of ways of breaking down problems, which have been super effective for a lot of things that have happened in the past hundreds of years for capitalism, colonialism, industrialism, by breaking down things into parts and then having certain parts that matter and other parts that don't matter or are lesser than. You can make a lot of material progress. Unfortunately, we've reached this point in the evolution of our kind of world ecosystem, where the ecosystem is starting to break down, and we're seeing that in terms of some of the things you mentioned about like pollinators, or just the collapse of insect populations and other types of things. So I think the sense that people have of greater connectedness to some of the other organisms and beings in the world. I mean, some of it is, again, it's like enlightened self-interest, because, if we can't forge a way of living on this planet that is sustainable for the whole ecosystem, we're not going to be able to survive. Our technology is not going to be able to allow us to survive. So I think we have to start breaking down these ideas of a dualist way of looking at things, even though they're so entrenched in all of our institutions and ways of knowing. Ultimately, they have to dissolve in favor of something that's more like, from an indigenous perspective, of seeing all of us as related, all of us as interconnected, all of us as interdependent, as participating in a worldwide, democracy of all beings. We have to move towards that in order to survive. So I think that the fact that it's starting to happen now more, I think is really good. I think it needs to happen even faster. And I think that looking at plants in this different way through a more ethical lens can help to contribute to that, because it's really, in a lot of ways, not consistent with the way that we're treating the natural world. So it's challenging that belief of segmenting beings into the important ones and the unimportant ones. It's saying we're all important and we all need to be treated respectfully, instead of just saying, well, we have more power, so we can do whatever we want to the people, to the beings that don't have power and don't have to think about it. I think that it's questioning that kind of logic. So you can expect pushback, because our institutions are not set up to facilitate that kind of thinking. Our institutions are facilitating their own survival and in the current ways of majority world thinking continuing.
Yeah, well said. I mean, we could talk for a long time about all the evidence that has stared us in the face in the last several decades that our hierarchical ways of being in the world are coming back to bite us. They are not working. Well, Paul, I am just so excited by what you're doing, and I see you and the Plant Initiative as making a really vital contribution. I very much encourage people to go to plantinitiative.org. I will also spell that out in the show notes and take a look in a little more depth. As we close, do you all have any upcoming activities or projects or offerings or a vision that you're building for your next stage that you'd like to tell us about?
At this point, we are certainly looking at planning some more future events. We have a number of different, interviews, like video interviews, similar to like what we're doing today, where we have it live with an audience, and so we are planning several of those and networking opportunities. We're just kind of trying to continue on the same trajectory we've been on, and we have kind of an annual report you can see on our website about what we've done in the past. We've been giving out grants to other organizations that are working on trying to improve respect for plants and trying to build connections where we can with others that are interested in the same topic. So I would say just subscribe to our email newsletter or visit our website and you'll see what we're up to, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today. And to those who will be watching this video online, feel free to contact us at the Plant Initiative if you have any questions or to learn more. And thank you so much for the invitation today. I really enjoyed our conversation, and it was great to have a chance to participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your time. I really appreciate it and the work that you are doing.
Thank you for listening to Humans and Earth. Please share this episode to broaden engagement in the regeneration our world needs. You'll find social media links in the show notes. To explore our other offerings, visit www.humansandearth.com.